I call this a psychohistorical memoir because to answer the question that led me to writing the book, which was, how is it so easy for a good kid like me from a small farming community in upstate New York to have followed an order of a man to go 9,000 miles from my hometown to participate in destroying other people's villages? Because as I was in Vietnam, I realized it was so absurd, I could hardly believe I was there. It was almost surreal. So to answer that question, of course, you could argue that it's an easy way to, you can easily answer it by saying, well, I just happened to be of a certain age at a certain time in my country's history when we were told we had to go off to war to preserve democracy from the evils of communism. And at the time, I was in graduate school and I actually got drafted. And my early life, I was just basically a happy young kid, fishing and swimming, and by the time I got to high school, I was a really good athlete, and I was a good student, and I was on a student council, and I was in my Baptist Youth Fellowship, and it was all kind of pretty groovy, really. My parents were very right-wing Republicans, which didn't mean anything to me at the time because I was just, growing up and playing sports. And so when I got drafted and I was in graduate school, I didn't think that could happen because that was pre-lottery. And I had a 2S deferment, which some of you may remember the deferment system under the conscription before lottery. And if you were a full-time student in good standing, you had a deferment from the draft, I thought. In my case, the Selective Service Board told me that there was a loophole in the school deferment process, and I fell through the loophole. And it's kind of a complicated loophole, so I don't need to explain the loophole, but the fact was that I was a total believer in the United States and fighting communism. I just didn't want to do the fighting myself, and that's what they call a chicken hawk. A hawk on the war, but a chicken that didn't want to fight in the war. But because I didn't have any political or philosophical opposition to the United States being in Vietnam, I instead enlisted in a 4-year Air Force program instead of going in the Army or the Marines, which I really didn't have any interest in doing. And I went in as an officer thinking this was an easy way out and where I would be able to make more money and not see any combat. And I thought it was working pretty well. For the first 2 years, I was in Headquarters Air Force in Washington on a very plush white-collar assignment. It was kind of boring, but I continued going to graduate school at night, where I had been going to school before I was drafted. So it was pretty cool. But then I got my orders to be a commander, even if it's a low-level commander of a Air Force Ranger unit, which I had no idea even existed, and I certainly wasn't seeking it out. So I was sent to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, trained by Air Force personnel who had been through the Fort Benning Army Ranger School in Georgia to train me and 558 other airmen in Ranger techniques. I was one of the 21 officers in the squadron, and I was assigned 40 men during those 12 weeks to be trained with and then sent to Vietnam. Well, as it turns out, my Vietnam experience actually provoked one major epiphany in my life that changed my life forever. And for that, I'm eternally grateful, because I was really asleep, as was so easy to do in this country, so easily be asleep. And basking in the rhetoric of the greatest country in the history of the world, endowed by God to bring Christianity to the heathen and prosperity to the impoverished. It was a great story. I liked it. I thought it was cool. And I was rudely awakened in a village in Vietnam in April of 1969, when after a bombing mission, I was assessing the success of the bombing mission per a duty asked of me by the Vietnamese base commander at the base where my men were protecting the perimeter from attacks. And what I witnessed was I went into 5 villages in a week. It was during the daytime. It was not dangerous. It was only dangerous at night. So I knew it was no big deal. And I was very naive about what a target was. And what I discovered was that all the targets that were being bombed in the region of the Mekong Delta where I was were inhabited fishing villages. What I witnessed were basically somewhere between 700 and 900 murdered Vietnamese civilians, half of whom at least were children. They'd all been napalmed after the bombing, and you know, there were 3. I think there were 3 bombing runs. This was within an hour after the attacks, so there were bodies everywhere, and you could smell the napalm. You could smell the chemical residue from the bombs. You could smell the burning flesh, and I was in shock. I was in shock, and actually was kind of sick. And I never really have recovered from that in the sense that I call it irreversible knowledge. I knew that those people on the ground were authentic people living in their villages, and I very quickly came to realize that I was not particularly authentic at all, because I was following an ideology that sent me 9,000 miles away from my hometown to participate in destroying these people in their villages who probably had never left their villages or had never been very far from their villages. And I realized I was on the wrong side. I mean, at the time, I mean, maybe there are no sides, really, if you're a Buddhist, and I certainly wasn't a Buddhist at that point. But I figured, this is so incredibly evil and diabolical and criminal and absurd that I just knew that everything I had been taught was really BS. It really was incredible that I could have believed everything that I had been told by my church, my school, my parents, my political system about our country, and it led to this incredible carnage that was going on that I was participating in. And how could you spend that kind of energy, a nation spending that kind of energy and resources on another country, destroying it, if there wasn't some pattern behind it? I mean, this was not an aberration. I realized very quickly I had to really begin studying the history of the United States, and then I had to study the history of empires. I had to understand the history of obedience. I had to study the history of vertical power structures that grew out of the Fertile Crescent in 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. So a lot of what I'm talking about in this book is describing my process and my journey of trying to understand the answer to that question of how easy it was to do what I did, which is very typical and normal for many people. I mean, there were people, of course, during the Vietnam War that resisted and went to Canada or went to trial, went to jail. Probably 20% of all those eligible for the draft in the 60s did not agree to go to the war. So there were a fifth, probably, of young people who knew something was not right about that. When I got back from Vietnam in 1969, I still had a year left to do in the military. I was sent home after 5 months because after I was in those villages, I spoke out against the war to my superiors every day. Every day, I was saying this war is illegal, it's unconscionable, it's violating the rules of engagement that I had to learn in officer training school. You do not target civilians or civilian infrastructure. My superiors always laughed when I said that. It was obviously just not relevant in war. There are no rules of war. But I got assigned to being a executive commander of a supply squadron, which was a relatively easy assignment. But that year I joined the Unitarian Fellowship in Alexandria, Louisiana. I didn't know about Unitarians. I had been a Baptist. I had studied for the Baptist ministry even before I was in the military. And I thought, wow, these people are really interesting. They actually have they talk about things, they have discussions, and I didn't ever been in a discussion like this. And I got so active in that fellowship that there was about 20 people that came every Sunday. They asked me if I would be the Sunday program director to find speakers for Sunday. I was just totally enthusiastic to do this. This was like in my new life. And I got very involved in the Rapides Parish Interracial Coalition, which was helping to desegregate the schools under court order. I mean, it was like I was truly in a kind of different place. So when I got out of the military, I resumed graduate school, finished law school, and was jolted once again when I started my first case in as a criminal lawyer. I was shocked, or not struck, shock wasn't the right word, but I was really overtaken by the bailiff's loud order when he said, "Everybody rise." And of course, I knew that was the protocol of the court, but I didn't rise. And it wasn't that I was thinking about not rising, it was that I was just really, my body was shaking. Like, oh man, I have to automatically stand up for an authority figure. And my body just didn't want to do it. And it happened 2 more times in a week. And even though the judge in each case saw that I was a rookie and was very kind in saying, there were 3 different judges, very kind in just saying, son, you know, this is the protocol of the court. And I wasn't intending to create any problems. But I knew that I was feeling this strong pulse in my body that somehow that is not right for me to do that. I did that for 4 years in the military, and I'm not really going to do it anymore. So I walked out, and that was the end of my law career. After all that money, all that tuition, all those books, all that study, all those cases I briefed in law school, I was like, wow, how could that happen? And I really was embarrassed, actually, so embarrassed about it, I didn't tell anybody why I wasn't going to go back. Because I was not proud of it, actually. I didn't even know quite what was happening. So it saved me from having a career, a secure career, which in a way liberated me even more, as it turns out, because I didn't have anything to protect. I didn't make a lot of money to have a high lifestyle. And one experience after another just kept kind of rolling into my lap. And so a lot of this book is about all those experiences that were rolling into my lap, not knowing what was going to come one after another. But it enabled me actually to have quite an interesting life that was out of the American box almost completely. My parents were absolutely appalled at what happened to their son. We were breached until they died in 1988 and 1989. They never understood what happened to me, and I'm sure that's not that uncommon. But I was kind of a homeboy when I grew up, so it was kind of painful to know that my parents wouldn't validate what I was trying to express to them. And but that's the way it is. So much of this book, again, describes this journey. It's kind of sometimes I call it a metaphorical map for those who want to get liberated from the American way of life. And the first title of my manuscript was Going AWOL from the American Way of Life. which is a devastating pathological system, typical of the West, which I try to describe in this book, that it's very, at least in my case, I share this process. I was a really good student of becoming a successful male, which I thought was what was expected, and I would make a lot of money, and I would have a good house and a secure career. So you have to learn individualism versus community. You learn competitiveness versus cooperation, and you learn acquisition, what I like to say acquisition versus inquisition. You learn the high values are consumerism and acquiring things, rather than inquisition or curiosity and questioning things. So I was very good at accepting those basic tenets of capitalism and found out that I had been dehumanized. So for me, not being able to do my career actually enabled me to start practicing rehumanizing myself or recovering. And in the 80s, I did spend a lot of time in Central America, as I'm sure some of you were and have maybe still go down there. And it was those experiences that led me to the steps of the Capitol in 1986 when I fasted with 3 other veterans for 47 days on water only. It was actually an open-ended fast. We didn't know we would stop at 47 days. One of our 4 was quite sick at the time, and we ended the fast rather than take a chance that he would die, even though we had not quite clearly established when we might come off the fast, if we were to come off the fast, but that was a test, and we didn't want him to die. So we ended the fast. We had just been on the Phil Donahue show a couple of days earlier, and so we had thousands of letters all of a sudden pleading with us to stop and telling us all the actions they were doing around the country in solidarity with our fast, at least 500 actions. So about exactly a year after that fast started is when I went to the tracks at Concord, or that's the year after is when I decided to start another fast on the tracks. We had been going to Nicaragua and El Salvador during the Reagan years to protest the Reagan's terrorist policies and against the Nicaraguan people for being in a revolutionary process, which was unacceptable to the United States, of course. And also the El Salvadoran Revolution, which was manifested in a guerrilla warfare, which Reagan was funding, not funding, but funding the Salvadoran government to combat the revolutionary struggle to the tune of $600 million a year in El Salvador. And so we had all been, those of us involved with the plan to go to the tracks at Concord, we'd all spent a lot of time with the people in El Salvador and Nicaragua. We had lots of stories from the survivors of attacks. Of course, we had been through the ritual of what we were taught in civics class, which was to petition the government, to ask them, demand of them to comply with the law and to comply with the Constitution and refrain from murdering people in other countries. Well, so we had decided that the petitioning of Congress was not working at all. As you might know, it's still not working. We decided to go to where the weapons were coming from, going to El Salvador and Nicaragua, that were killing thousands of people in both countries and maiming many other thousands. And it happened that the weapons were coming from Concord, California Naval Weapons Station, 35 miles east of San Francisco. So we started a vigil there on June 10th, 1987. It was a vigil, a daily vigil, often day and night. Initially, just a vigil off the tracks, watching all the trains come down the tracks and the trucks coming down the road parallel to the tracks. Those trains and trucks' only function was to move munitions from bunkers to Port Chicago, where they're loaded on ships headed for El Salvador and Nicaragua. People started getting arrested right away, actually blocking trucks. All summer long, this was going on. I was a jail support person. After observing out there most of the summer, I decided that on September 1st, I and 2 other veterans, we would actually sit on the tracks, on the railroad ties between the rails, and block the trains with our bodies. This had been done at Concord Naval Weapons Station since 1965. It was not that unusual to be happening. There was a protocol for how the authorities were going to call the police and have people arrested, which started, as I said, in 65 and went on throughout the Vietnam War and then picked up again in Reagan years. The train speed is 5 miles an hour. There's 2 spotters in the front of the locomotive to make sure the tracks are always clear. The penalty on the sign where we were vigiling for blocking trains, the penalty said $5,000 fine, 1 year in prison. Fair enough. We expected to go to prison. So I sent a letter to the base commander. A copy of the letter's in the book. The commander sent a cable to his superiors in Washington, D.C. That cable's in the book. And we took our position on September 1st, having been denied a visit with the base commander. And the first train came at about 5 minutes at noon. And the next thing I know, I woke up in a hospital. I have no memory of what happened. The train accelerated to 17 miles an hour, and I went completely under the train. I didn't get out of the way in time. My autonomic nervous system and adrenaline didn't register the danger until too late. I mean, we found out that the train crew on that day had been ordered not to stop the train. We have the train crew's statements that they were ordered that day, and that day only, not to stop the train. The train was speeding at more than 3 times the legal speed limit. The Navy ambulance that came within 2 minutes after I was struck refused to help me because they said my body was not lying on Navy property, and left. Delayed getting to a hospital by 27 minutes. My friends, on this picture on the cover, there were 40 of my friends there that day. They're all rallying around my body between the rails, trying to stop my bleeding and keep my energy going. I reconstruct this from all my friends because I have no memory of it. The day after, by the way, that 9,000 people showed up at the tracks, which was 4 days after I was hit. And there's at least one person in the room here that said they were there that day. Ripping up 300-foot section of the tracks with their hands and hand tools and stacking the railroad ties in a sculptor. And the police just had to watch because there were too many people. They couldn't stop it. And so I just heard about this in the hospital. I mean, I'm coming into consciousness about the 4th or 5th day. And incidentally, as an aside, from that day, September 5th on, they fixed the tracks within a week or 2. But from that point on, there was a permanent encampment on the tracks for 870 consecutive days, day and night. No train ran without requiring a large number of arrests every day for every train and every truck. The first investigator came to question me in the hospital on September 17th. I'd been there since September 1st. And the first question he asked me was, Mr. Willson, when did you begin planning to board the train, i.e. hijack? I said, what? Where did you come up with that idea? He didn't answer that question. he went on to another question. A couple days later, an FBI agent was fired after almost 22 years in the FBI for having refused to investigate me and one of the other veterans on the tracks as a domestic terror suspect. So the story started getting clearer what had happened. And again, there's a certain naivete I live with because the way I grew up, the way I see the world, it's hard for me to imagine the level of diabolical nature of nation-state policies, including against its own citizens. But it was another good example of what happens to people all over the world who stand in the way of our imperialism. Since 1798, the United States has militarily invaded at least 560 times in over 100 countries. Don't you think that's kind of interesting? Since World War II, the United States has covertly intervened thousands of times in over 100 countries. Don't you think that's kind of interesting? And since World War II, we've bombed 28 countries. We have ships in every, military ships in every sea space. We have military airplanes in every airspace. We have troops in 150 countries in nearly 1,000 bases. Now, we're human beings. We predate nation states. We predate empires. We have in us the capacity to rediscover what it's like to live in cooperative relationships locally in food-sufficient cultures, because that's how we originated, and that's what carried us for hundreds of thousands of years. Whether we'll do that, I don't know. I think it is a really kind of a sad commentary when I heard that Move On was having these living room meetings recently, and they were talking about restoring the American dream. What? The American dream? It's built on dispossession of other people.